In a world where politics, satire, and personal attacks are often mixed together, there are moments that force us to rethink the boundaries of what is permissible. One such moment was at a charity gala where a well-known journalist made a sharp mockery of the young Barron Trump. However, instead of the expected reaction of the audience, this evening became a historical lesson in endurance, wisdom, and the power of words. The gala at the Fairmont Grand was one of the most anticipated events of the year. The luxurious ballroom radiated elegance. Shining crystal chandeliers, mirrored columns, and glare of light on the marble floor. The air was filled with the muffled hum of small talk, laughter, and the light clinking of crystal glasses. It was an evening that brought together influential businessmen, actors, politicians, journalists, and other elite representatives of society. All of them came to support a charity initiative aimed at helping children from low-income families. Among the guests of the evening, sitting unnoticed by most, was Barron Trump. The young man, who had just turned 18, was invited as a guest of honor because of family ties. He was not the center of attention, did not seek it, and did not try to impress with his presence. His tall, thin figure contrasted with the luxurious outfits around him. Barron's eyes were calm and attentive. He was simply observing. His hands were on the table. He did not make sudden movements, did not try to interfere with conversations at neighboring tables. The waiters glided around the room, holding dishes on silver trays, decorated as if they were works of art. The music of a quartet was playing in the background, adding to the sophistication of the event. The atmosphere was filled with anticipation as everyone knew that the main event of the evening was yet to come. When the host of the evening, a man in a classic black tuxedo, announced the main speaker, the room fell silent. She was an influential journalist, known for her sharp criticism and bold political statements. She took the stage with ease, a confident smile lighting up her face. Her mannerisms exuded control and charisma, and her voice was tinged with irony. "Good evening, ladies and gentlemen," she said, and the audience responded with polite applause. At first, her speech was light, even entertaining. She began with innocent anecdotes about New York traffic and awkward moments at past galas. The audience laughed, feeling relaxed. It was the style they were used to: intelligent, sarcastic language that touched on social issues but did not go beyond the bounds of what was permitted. However, gradually the tone of her speech changed. She began to touch upon politics and famous figures with it. At first, these were humorous hints, subtle remarks that made the audience smile. However, after a few minutes, her words became sharp. She started talking about political legacies, the influence of strong families on state processes, and then smoothly moved on to a topic that many expected but did not know if she would dare to touch on. "And what about the Trump family?" she asked, her voice taking on a mocking tone. "Love them or hate them, let's face it, they always give us a lot to talk about." There was laughter in the room. Some smiled more broadly, others reservedly, not wanting to express their attitudes openly. "I'm sure you all agree that Donald Trump's greatest contribution to our culture is that he made orange a fashionable color." This joke caused a wave of laughter, although some of the audience remained tense. Barron sat motionless, his expression unchanged. He just stared straight ahead, listening intently. The journalist continued. "And of course, we can't forget about his greatest legacy, the next generation. Let's talk about Barron." The room fell into a tense silence. Some looked at the young man, who was still calm. But the journalist did not stop. Imagine growing up in a golden tower, where every move is recorded by cameras, surrounded by marble and gilding, while the rest of us are just trying to get through another Monday. It must have been a valuable life experience. An uncomfortable laugh spread through the room. It was not the laughter that had accompanied her previous jokes. It was muffled, strained, because people didn't know how to respond. Several people quickly turned their gaze to Barron. Some sighed, realizing that a line had been crossed. Barron remained motionless. His eyes were still calmly looking forward. He didn't look down, clench his fists, or grimace. The journalist, sensing the change in mood in the room, tried to save the day. "Oh, I'm sorry. That was a little harsh, wasn't it? This comment only emphasized how unnecessary her joke was. The audience felt uncomfortable. People started whispering to each other. Some took a sip of wine, others looked down. And Barron, he still didn't react. With every second he remained calm, the tension in the room only grew. The journalist finally felt that she had lost control of the situation. Her smile was no longer so confident, and her voice became less playful. The silence lingered. Even the orchestra, which had been playing softly in the background, stopped playing. No one knew what was going to happen next. And then Barron slowly rose from his seat. His tall stature made him even more noticeable, and at that moment all eyes were on him. He was in no hurry. He just stood there, letting the moment unfold. The whole room stood still in anticipation. Barron took a step forward. The journalist, who had controlled all the attention a moment ago, now stood in indecision. She did not know what he would say or do. Everyone was waiting, and when he finally opened his mouth, his words changed the course of the entire evening. Barron took a few leisurely steps forward, allowing the silence to take deeper root in the atmosphere of the room. His calmness, which at first had been perceived as ordinary restraint, now had a new connotation. It was a confidence born not of a desire to show off, but of absolute control over the situation. The people who had just laughed at the journalist's joke now froze, not knowing where to look. The journalist, who a minute ago felt like the mistress of the stage, lowered the microphone as if realizing that control had slipped from her hands. The audience watched Barron, trying to predict how he would react. But his behavior was unexpected. He was in no hurry. His every move was deliberate. Several of the waiters who were still serving the guests stopped, fell silent. Some clutched a napkin in their hands. Others raised a glass to their lips, but never took a sip. The room was so tense that you could hear the subtle sound of air conditioning and the distant footsteps of security guards at the entrance. Barron's eyes slowly scanned the room. His expression did not change. He did not allow himself any hint of irritation or resentment. At that moment, many people realized that something much more important than an ordinary secular conflict was happening before their eyes. It was a moment when the true nature of a person was being revealed without unnecessary words, without public demonstrations. For a moment, the journalist seemed to be trying to regain control, raising the microphone closer to her lips. But there was no support in the room that she expected. Even those who were used to laughing at her jokes now felt uncomfortable. She realized that her words, which had always had the power to provoke a reaction, had not worked this time. And this was the worst-case scenario for someone who builds a career on the power of her rhetoric. Barron did not speak immediately. He stood there, letting everyone feel the weight of the moment. Some of the guests began to realize that real power is not in loud words or sarcastic remarks, but in the ability to control yourself, even when you are provoked. He slowly looked at the journalist. Her eyes showed something like confusion, like a person who realized that she had crossed a line. She might have wanted to turn back the clock herself, to erase those words from her speech, to make sure that they had never been said. But it was too late. Someone at a neighboring table moved a glass, and this quiet sound seemed loud in the oppressive silence of the hall. People began to realize that they were witnessing something more than a normal performance. It was a rare moment when someone who was supposed to be ridiculed not only resisted the pressure, but also made others reconsider their actions. The sound of cameras could be heard in the distance. One of the guests was filming the situation on his phone, realizing that this moment would go viral. Social networks were already waiting for it. But inside the room, it still felt like they were in a vacuum, isolated from the outside world, with only this young man in the spotlight. Barron finally took another step forward. His gaze was direct but not defiant. He could have gotten angry. He could have retaliated. He could have even walked out of the room to show his indignation. But he took none of these obvious steps. Instead, he continued to stand straight, confident, like a man who understands more than people think. It was not just silence, it was a message. There was a subtle movement in the crowd as some began to realize that they had to support him. In the far corner of the room, the first applause was heard. They were quiet, timid, as if people were not yet sure whether to support them. But the wave began to grow. First a few people, then more. Soon the whole room was applauding. It was unexpected, not the journalist's applause, not the joke, but the man who, with his silent stoicism, answered everything that had been said. The journalist looked down. She was not expecting this. She thought she was in control of the situation, that her words would shape the mood of the evening. But the opposite happened, and now she could only stand in front of this young man, realizing that all eyes were now directed at her, not with admiration, but with condemnation. Barron took a step back, returning to his desk. His face remained unchanged, but his posture had a sense of finality to it. He hadn't done anything extra, hadn't said anything extra, but he had won, and everyone in the room realized it. The applause continued for a few more seconds before gradually subsiding. People went back to their conversations, but the tone of the evening had already changed. They were no longer talking about the sharpness of the journalist's jokes. They were talking about a young man who had proved with his calmness that strength is not always about loudly spoken words. Sometimes true strength is simply standing your ground, not letting others define who you are. The applause gradually died down, but the feeling that something significant had happened did not disappear. The people in the audience remained in silent reflection for some time, their eyes darting between Barron and the journalist, who now looked much less confident. She lowered the microphone, as if realizing that continuing in the same vein would be unnecessary. Barron slowly took his seat. He did not look for support with his eyes, did not demand approval. His reaction, which consisted of impeccable self-control and restraint, was a response that spoke more than any words. This moment was not calculated. It happened naturally, and that is what made it so powerful. People who were just watching at first now felt like they were part of something bigger. The evening continued, but the atmosphere changed. The waiters continued to serve the guests. The musicians resumed the light melody, but the conversations at the tables took on a different character. Where there had been light, carefree laughter before, there were now quiet discussions dominated by a respectful tone. People no longer talked about the journalist, her performance gradually fading into the shadows, but instead everyone was discussing Barron's reaction. For many, his behavior was a lesson. In a world where emotional outbursts and loud statements have become the norm, calm confidence has proven to be the most powerful tool. He did not respond with aggression to the provocation, did not stoop to the level of his opponent. And this was his main advantage. The journalist remained near the stage, visibly embarrassed. She had not expected such a development. Her jokes usually drew applause, not made people think about ethical boundaries. She realized that this time she had lost control of the audience. It was a moment when her influence diminished not because of argument or criticism, but because of a silent resistance that outweighed any words. Barron did not do anything special after his speech. He did not show triumph or pride, did not try to use the situation to his advantage. He just continued to sit at the table, sometimes flipping through the pages of the event program, answering a few questions from guests who approached him. His calmness only emphasized that this situation was not a special event for him. It was just one of many evenings in his life where he chose to be himself. Rumors of what had happened spread quickly. People who were not direct witnesses were already receiving messages, watching the first frames of the video shot on their phones. The first comments and analyses of the situation began to appear on social media, with many expressing admiration for Barron's self-control. Some wrote that his response was the best political statement without words, while others compared his behavior to that of prominent historical figures who knew that silence was the most powerful weapon. At this time, changes began to take place in the ballroom. Those who had initially supported the journalist's jokes now felt uncomfortable, as if they had to reconsider their own ideas about humor and the limits of what was acceptable. Some even left the evening early, wanting to avoid awkward conversations or unwanted attention. Event managers, who had been observing the situation up to that point, were now reconsidering their approach to such events. The organizers of future events began to wonder whether they should allow sharp satirists and political commentators to use the stages of charity events to attack personalities who were not public figures. The journalist, who had tried to make herself the center of attention that evening, was now forced to consider the consequences of her words. With each passing minute, the evening was turning into a moment that went beyond the usual gala event. It would leave a mark not only in the news the next day, but also in the minds of those who were present. Barron remained calm. His demeanor did not change until the very end of the evening. When the event came to an end, he calmly stood up, shook a few hands, thanked the organizers, and left the hall without any fuss. He left behind a trail of conversations, analysis, and new perspectives on the situation. He wasn't trying to prove anything, but that's what made him the most prominent figure that evening. The next morning, all major news outlets were reporting on this moment. The video that got on the internet went viral. The journalist gave an official statement, admitting that her jokes were inappropriate. But the main attention was focused on Barron, a young man who changed the course of the evening with his endurance, leaving behind not just a moment, but a whole wave of rethinking of public culture. The morning after the gala, the public discourse changed dramatically. What began as a charity event turned into a media phenomenon that unfolded before the eyes of the world. Articles, analytics, and discussions on social media all focused on one topic: Barron Trump's reaction to the attempt to ridicule him. The video of the event spread like lightning, and every commentator tried to express their opinion. But there was only one key point that everyone was discussing: his endurance. The editors of the leading media were thinking about how to present this moment in a way that would not damage their own image. Some traditional media chose their words carefully, trying not to take sides. Others frankly admitted that the journalist's attempt to ridicule Barron was unsuccessful. Most commentators noted that his silent response was much stronger than any political speech. The journalist, who had been confident in front of the audience yesterday, felt differently about herself today. She did not expect that this moment would be decisive for her career. The interview invitations that used to come one after the other were now accompanied by questions that forced her to make excuses. Her editorial team considered various options, from a public apology to a change in media strategy, but the situation was beyond her control. Political analysts began to analyze the significance of the event from different angles. Some believed that it was just another media scandal that would quickly disappear from view. Others saw it as a sign of social change, a moment when even the most judgmental viewers began to realize the importance of respect, regardless of political preferences. Many wondered whether we had become so accustomed to aggression in the media that we were losing the ability to distinguish between satire and ethics. Amid all this, Barron himself remained silent. He did not comment, did not respond to journalists' attempts to get an answer from him. His silence only strengthened his influence. People saw this as further proof that true strength comes from not letting others dictate your reaction. Meanwhile, a new debate unfolded on social media. Some users compared this moment to historical cases when leaders chose silent resistance as the best way to respond to provocations. Young people admired Barron's behavior, considering it an example of true confidence. Adults, on the other hand, found in this moment a reminder of the times when etiquette and self-control were valued more than loud words. In the corporate environment, the situation also resonated. Some large companies and organizations began to use this case in their communication training. Psychologists and leadership experts pointed out that calmness and emotional control are key elements of success. Barron may not have wanted to be an example, but his behavior became a guideline for many. The journalist nevertheless decided to make an official statement. She expressed regret, recognizing that her words could have been perceived as inappropriate. However, the reaction to her apology was mixed. Some saw it as a sincere gesture, while others saw it as an attempt to save her career. Regardless of her motives, she could no longer turn back the clock. She was no longer associated with her sharp style, but with a situation where she lost control of the audience. Barron, as before, remained on the sidelines of this whole discussion. He went back to his usual routine, not paying attention to what was happening around him. This fascinated people even more. In a world where everyone wants to say something, he chose silence. This silence spoke louder than any words. The impact of this moment did not disappear immediately. Even weeks after the event, people were still discussing the case. Analysts were trying to understand what made it so important, why Barron's reaction was so meaningful to society. The conclusion was obvious. In times when conflicts are becoming louder, the real strength lies in the ability to control oneself. This story was yet another confirmation that the most important lessons are not always taught in planned speeches or prepared performances. Sometimes one moment of silence changes everything. And for many people, this evening at the Fairmont Grand was just such a moment. As the days passed, the resonance of the gala's events did not subside. Although public attention usually quickly switches from one scandal to another, this situation was different. It had a deeper subtext touching not only on politics, but also on issues of respect, personal dignity, and the limits of what is permissible in public space. Analysts kept discussing why this particular case was so widely publicized and why Barron Trump's reaction was so resonant. At first glance, it was just another case of a famous journalist making a crude joke. This has happened before, and it usually provoked a quick reaction, but rarely had a lasting effect. However, the situation here was different. First of all, because Barron did not respond directly. His silence, his equanimity, and his restraint created the impression that he was head and shoulders above the situation. This was not a young man trying to defend himself or justify himself. This was a young man who demonstrated absolute control over himself. The journalist who caused the scandal had to back down. At first, she tried to justify her words by saying that it was just satire, part of her style. She reminded the audience that political criticism is a normal part of a democratic society. However, this argument did not work. People felt that unwritten rules of decency had been violated this time. Mocking someone who did not participate in public discussions, who did not make loud statements, and did not provoke criticism seemed unfair. This situation was especially acute among young people. Social networks exploded with thousands of posts in which young men and women expressed their attitude to the event. Some saw Barron as a symbol of dignity under pressure, while others simply enjoyed the moment when someone demonstrated restraint where emotions usually explode. But everyone agreed on one thing. This case showed that public figures have not only the power of words, but also the power of silence. Psychologists and communications experts also began to analyze the situation. They noted that Barron's behavior was a classic example of emotional intelligence. Where others might have lost control, he remained calm. Accordingly, people took this as a sign of strength, not weakness. This is what made his response so effective. Meanwhile, the media continued to broadcast reactions to the event. Some TV channels organized panel discussions, discussing what this situation means for the future of political satire. Others compared Barron's behavior with the reactions of other public figures in similar circumstances. One of the most common theses was that his reaction was indicative of a generational shift. While older politicians and public figures are accustomed to responding to attacks through statements or confrontation, the younger generation uses other approaches, ignoring, cold self-control, and avoiding open conflict. This situation also touched upon the topic of media responsibility. Well-known journalists who used to support their colleagues' style have become more cautious about this format. Some openly admitted that the line between satire and personal attack had been crossed. Others took a defensive stance, claiming that freedom of speech implies the possibility of sharp statements, even if someone does not like them. But regardless of these discussions, one thing was clear. The media space had undergone some changes. Despite all the noise around him, Barron continued to stay on the sidelines. He did not give interviews or make any official statements. For him, this situation was not a catastrophe or a cause for celebration. It was just another episode in his life that he dealt with as he saw fit. He continued to go about his business, avoiding any involvement in political or media controversies. His silence only added to his credibility in the eyes of those who followed the situation. Some tried to imagine what conclusions political and public figures could draw from this case. Will this be a sign for politicians that it is time to change their rhetoric? Will the media start to be more cautious about personal comments? Will commentators realize that the audience no longer perceives open attacks the way they used to? One of the main changes that occurred after this event was related to discussions about the limits of what is permissible in public space. Where does criticism end and personal insult begin? Does satire have limits? This question arose with renewed vigor in society. Many began to talk about the need to revise approaches to communication in society as a whole. Language was no longer just a tool of influence. It became the subject of deeper analysis, and many people began to realize that the culture of discussion needed to change. Ultimately, this event left an imprint on public memory. It became not just a media scandal, but a reminder of the importance of self-control, emotional intelligence, and respect. Barron Trump may not have sought to be a symbol of change, but his behavior taught society a lesson that will be remembered for a long time to come.